Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Doug Brake, the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation about how to close the homework gap and boost online education. For those of you not familiar with ITIF, we are a technology-focused think tank in Washington, D.C. We aim to formulate, evaluate, and promote policy solutions that accelerate innovation and boost productivity to spur growth, opportunity, and progress. We're very proud that the University of Pennsylvania has ranked ITIF the world's leading think tank for science and technology policy for 3 years running. The topic for today's discussion is the homework gap under coronavirus. Effective online education is a big, multifaceted topic, but a key baseline question is whether students have the capability to connect online. Unfortunately, this is not the case for all students. NTIA estimates that roughly 7 million school-age children lack broadband internet access at home. Others estimate even more students lack availability to devices to do schoolwork. The social distancing required under COVID-19 pandemic has forced this problem front and center and galvanized policymakers to close the gap. We're very fortunate today to be joined by FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. She's the longest serving Democratic commissioner at the FCC, having originally been nominated for the position by President Obama in 2012. She's long been a leading voice on a range of broadband issues, but perhaps most prominent is her leadership on the homework gap. A quick note on our format. I have a series of questions for the commissioner for the next about 20-25 minutes or so. And then we'll turn things over to my colleague, Daniel Castro, who will lead a conversation with two excellent discussants, Danielle Davis of the National Urban League and Angela Seifer with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Danielle and Angela will have time for questions at the end. Feel free to submit those through our website, which you'll find at itif.org. Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule.
Well, sure. Thank you, ITIF, for the work you do, and also for the focus you're bringing today to this element of the digital divide that I call the homework gap.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, very important issue. It's long been an important issue, and it feels like now it's like really been front and center. Obviously, the pandemic has forced this sort of to the front of everyone's mind and put it really in sharp relief when we're expecting students to be doing schoolwork from home, and not all of them have access. It's a critical problem right now. But you have been a real leader, as I mentioned, on this issue, the homework gap. I mean, long before this pandemic. I'm hoping you could sort of give us an introduction, how you've been thinking about this issue, and sort of how your thinking has changed in the last couple of months with the current crisis.
Well, thank you. That's such a good way to start. The way I often try to define the homework gap for people is I point out that when I was growing up, if I needed to do homework, it was paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. And that third one was always the hardest part. But those days are gone. Now you need internet access to do so much nightly schoolwork. In fact, 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires internet access. But the data at the Federal Communications Commission repeatedly show that 1 in 3 households do not have it. And where those numbers overlap is what I call the homework gap. And there are millions of kids who are falling into it. And on a good day before this crisis, you would see them at a fast food restaurant nursing a soda and typing out a paper, or lingering at the library just before closing to be able to download math sets and participate in research in their class. But now, here we are in this unprecedented crisis. 50 million students have been told, go home. Their schools have shuttered. And so many of them have been told to go on class online. But what we're realizing is that homework gap is real because so many students do not have the connectivity they need to get to class in this crisis. And like so many crises in the past, it is focusing our attention on this problem. And I think now it's up to us to solve the homework gap, to fix it during this pandemic, and make sure it's not a problem going forward when we get to the other side.
Thank you. Yes, no, that's a great framing. It seems to me it's like this has long been an issue And it seems like now we have a very short-term crisis that we really want to focus our efforts to try to bridge this gap as quickly and effectively as we can in the short term. I'm curious if you can walk us through, discuss some of the policy options or different frameworks available, the tools that the FCC already has now. I'm thinking like things like the E-rate program that could possibly help get connectivity out the door as quickly as possible.
Yeah, the FCC has tools right now. We just got to be creative about how we use them. And in a crisis, that's what you need to do in government. You need to be creative to help public policy reach the people it needs to reach. And the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which is a long time ago. I mean, I had an AOL email account then. It was a while back. Congress decided in that law that it was important to connect our nation's schools and libraries to the internet, which probably at the time was called the information superhighway. So they were prescient that the internet and online world was going to be important for education. And now, decades later, the E-rate program supports connectivity in classrooms in every state in this country. And it provides more support for that connectivity if the classrooms are in a rural area or if the school has a lot of students who are on the free and reduced lunch program. So the neat thing about E-rate is it's been in existence for a while. It's supported connectivity, and it's a map of where need and homework gap problems are probably the greatest. So now what we have to do is look at that statute from 1996 and see, can we apply it so we meet this moment? And if you spend some time with Section 254 of the law, what you'll see is that the FCC has the authority to support, for educational purposes, connectivity to the classroom. I'm going to argue right now that the classroom is migrated from a school building to the kitchen table. It's at home. We need to think about it that way. Moreover, the statute suggests that we can support additional services if they're for educational purposes. So right here, right now, we have this tool in the law to work with the schools that get E-rate support, to give them funding so they can do things like purchase mobile hotspots to hand out to the students most likely in need. And that way we can get more students online, more students participating in education, and more students connected to their schools and to learning during this crisis.
Absolutely. So do I understand right? There's some question about the interpretation of the statute.
Wait, listen. So I'm going to pull that back. I don't even think there is. And if you don't believe in my interpretation, I will point out to you that in 2010 and 2011, the FCC ran a pilot program doing something very similar. In other words, the agency's already found that authority in the law. We just have to go back and figure out how to use it at broader scale.
I'm in agreement here, Commissioner.
Okay.
I think today all students are working, learning from home. Absolutely. It seems like the FCC has the authority. Even my understanding has an emergency request pending. From I believe from New America Foundation
That's right.
has filed that. So it seems like there are mechanisms whereby the FCC has the option to act. I'm curious though. How can maybe Congress follow on here? Is there opportunity to maybe force some clarity on the interpretation of the statute, or provide more funds? Congress is looking at a couple of different packages following on the CARE Act and trying to figure out how we can help fix this problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I actually spent part of this morning talking on a roundtable with education and technology leaders with Senator Chris Van Hollen on it today. And I understand that Congresswoman Grace Meng is introducing a bill on these issues today. There's just a lot of interest in Congress from members on Capitol Hill on this issue. Absolutely. Because they see it too. They see what a crisis we're in. And there's so much about this experience that's hard and unknowable, but it's within our power to fix this one. So there's a lot of momentum building to do that. And during the CARES Act and the build up to the CARES Act, there was a lot of discussion about clarifying to the extent necessary any FCC authority, but also providing the FCC with as much as $2 billion more to make sure that the agency had the funding it needed to help every school provide connectivity for its students at home. And it's my hope that if there is another stimulus bill or coronavirus big piece of legislation, that this issue will be front and center. I think now, after weeks of learning at home, I think we have a sense of just what a crisis we have on our hands. As I've pointed out to some people now, parking lot Wi-Fi has become a thing in this country. We've got parents driving to the school parking lot and library parking lot and coffee shops and just sitting in the car for hours to let their kids connect for class and do their schoolwork. And cheers to all those people who are making that happen, because they've got the kind of grit that's going to make them successful in life. But I think we could go one step further and make sure every one of those students gets an adequate connection at home. And so if there's additional legislative activity to clarify the FCC's authority, though I think it's already quite clear, but also to give the agency additional funding to make it happen, that's all good. And I hope it will happen.
Excellent. Yeah, no, thank you. That's, I'm sure, helpful to some of the Hill staff watching. I'm curious, so you mentioned Wi-Fi hotspots as a potential option, and it seems like a good tool, a good way to, give students just a device, from the school to take home. But my understanding is there's been some supply chain challenges. Apparently there's difficulty procuring all the Wi-Fi hotspots. And it seems like, ideally this would be a sort of technology neutral program if Congress or libraries. I'm curious, you have thoughts of, like, presumably there are other ways we could get, connectivity options, if there are, potential self-install kits or something like that. Do you have any thoughts on the different options, different possible ways to sort of tailor this a hopeful, expansion of the E-rate program to get connectivity out there as quickly as possible to make that technology neutral?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In the end of the day, let's be for whatever works and can be put in place fast. A lot of times I talk about Wi-Fi hotspots and loaning those out because a lot of schools have experience with that. And that's how they try to address the homework gap during regular school. If they've got some subset of students they know might struggle to get connected, they might have a few of those to loan out. So that is something that they're familiar with and has already been used in schools and libraries. So it's something that's easy to rally around. But the honest truth is there are other solutions too. And it might take modems, routers, other kinds of connectivity. And we should be neutral as we approach this, as long as it's cost effective and something that can be distributed efficiently and fairly. And it's easy to talk about mobile hotspots, so I talk about that more often than other things. But there are going to be some areas of this country where that may not work. And we should be mindful that whatever works and can make it happen fast is what we should get behind.
Right. That makes sense. I don't know, somewhat unrelated, but I wanted to take the opportunity, your mention of Wi-Fi, for your leadership on opening up additional spectrum for unlicensed uses. I mean, having more spectrum, better broadband for Wi-Fi in the home, now that we have more and more devices connecting as everyone moves to teleworking at home. So thank you for your leadership on unlicensed spectrum. And
yeah, it's never been as easy to make the argument that we need more Wi-Fi in our lives as it has been during this crisis, as so many people are connecting for school, for work, for healthcare, for things like never before. And clearing up more of our skies so that there's more Wi-Fi and unlicensed spectrum is an important thing to do for our economy, for democratizing connectivity. And I'm really pleased that the FCC on a bipartisan basis has increasingly shown interest in doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I'm curious, so we have this sort of short-term crisis of we want to get, tools to get students connected in the short term as quickly as possible. But I mean, the internet adoption more generally, it's a tough problem, right? That isn't always as easily solved as some of the supply side infrastructure levers that we have to pull through policy making. I'm curious, thinking more long term about internet adoption generally, right? I mean, we have this issue where over 90%, I mean, by most measures, over 90% of American households have a connection that they could choose to subscribe to, but it's really only about 70% that do subscribe and to broadband in the home. So I'm curious just how you think about, this challenge of moving towards a society where we can, assume that everyone has a connection in the home. Are there tools more long-term to sort of drive internet adoption?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think it points to a real deficit in our conversation about the digital divide in Washington during the last several years. When we say digital divide, we frequently are talking about rural and remote areas and how to extend broadband infrastructure so it reaches those communities and those communities can thrive in the digital age. That is a big issue and something our nation has to address. But deployment is only half the challenge. Adoption is the other half. And what we're starting to realize is that in communities that may be wired, not every household has broadband access, and it might be constraining their healthcare, their education, their work experience. And in this crisis, we know it's having big impact. Plus, the numbers that are coming forward in this crisis about homework and kids and lack of connectivity are stunning. Here in the nation's capital, something like 30% of our households with children have no internet access. In Detroit, the number is closer to 60%. In other words, in some of our biggest cities, we have households that are consigned to the wrong side of the digital divide. And that's an issue of adoption. That's probably related to cost, digital literacy, and some other things. We got to start addressing that adoption issue with the same fervent kind of same kind of enthusiasm and energy that we have for addressing the expansion in rural areas. Because if we address both, we'll connect our country, and civic and commercial life is really going to benefit.
So we have just a few more minutes. I wanted to once again, thank you for putting this issue, the homework gap, and getting all students connected front and center for policymakers, as you have for so many years. I'm curious if you have any closing thoughts, any more general thoughts you'd like to share, either about the coronavirus pandemic and how that's forcing attention on some of your priorities, or other opportunities that you see, especially as Congress is looking to create legislation to solve some of these challenges and
yeah, I think the coronavirus is revealing some really hard truths about this country. And one of them is that the digital divide is big, and that the FCC's numbers coming out about it just aren't trustworthy. They're not real. They size the problem as much smaller than what reality around us suggests right now. And if that's true, we're going to have to revisit our thinking about how we get broadband for all. And right now, in this crisis, I think we need to make it a priority to get every student connected, solve the homework gap, use the E-rate authority we already have to do it. And I think if we do, we'll make a meaningful difference in the lives of millions of kids by making sure they can get an education during this crisis, stay connected to schools. And if we're successful, we'll leave no child offline.
Wonderful. Commissioner, thank you again. Really appreciate you joining me. I only regret that we weren't able to do this live. At this point, we have the whole room join us in thanking you for your remarks and your leadership on this issue.
And thank you. And thank you to the folks who are on the panel after us. Both of them are real dynamos when it comes to fixing the nation's digital divide. And I'm just so glad that you were able to bring all of us here today. So thank you to ITIF. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the work you do.
Absolutely. Thank you. With that, I'll turn things over to my colleague, Daniel Castro, for the panel discussion. Daniel, please take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Doug. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks also to the Commissioner for joining us today. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm Vice President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And joining me on this discussion is Danielle Davis, a Tech and Telecom Fellow at the National Urban League, and Angela Seifer, the Executive Director at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. First, thank you both for being part of this conversation. I know you're both working on these issues of inclusion and access for a while, and have a lot of interesting thoughts on it. And I know now is also the time we need to be having these conversations because people are very interested in how we can really make progress now. to the commissioner's point, I think she mentioned earlier that, everyone is seeing the crisis at this point. I think, certainly in reading some of your work, I think you've seen the crisis before. We know that it's a crisis, but now it's just so visible, right? And so there's definitely this new urgency. So just as a starting place for the conversation, I want to ask you, as the commissioner noted earlier, the FCC does have tools and it just needs to be creative about how to use them. So in regards to the homework app, what do you think we should be doing right now? Angela, maybe I'll start with you and then Danielle.
Thanks, Daniel, for having me. And Doug did a superb job with the commissioner, so kudos to Doug. They do have tools. They have Lifeline and they have E-rate. Those are the two tools that they can move most quickly on, making sure that there's no limitations to those tools, which there currently, there are. Only 25% of the folks who are eligible for Lifeline currently use Lifeline. So we definitely have an awareness problem with Lifeline itself, which that's totally doable, right? We can let folks know that they're eligible for that. E-rate, I think, gets a little bit trickier in that getting different portions of the FCC to agree with Commissioner Rosenworcel to be able to use it. I think that's a bigger political lift, but the awareness part of it, that should not be a problem.
Yeah, and can I just ask you to kind of expand on that awareness point? What do you think needs to be done to actually make that happen? And who needs to be the one doing it?
So I think the question for folks to ask is, whose job is it to make those who are eligible aware that they are eligible? Right now, it's kind of Danielle and I, right? It's not really our jobs, but we're the ones that disseminate it down to the organizations that work on the ground. And that's kind of ridiculous. It's a government function right now. Why is it not a government responsibility to increase awareness?
Danielle, same question to you, basically. What do you think we should be focusing on right now? What's the most urgent priority?
Well, just to piggy off of what Angela was saying was, yes, FCC does have tools at its disposal that can use right now. One of them being the Lifeline program. And the National Urban League has just signed on to a letter with MMTC that basically is requesting the FCC to use Section 254E to at least expand and continue with the Lifeline program. We think that that's probably the best and the most immediate way to at least address the concerns that are happening right now. But aside from that, we can also look to our community, our tech community, our broadband community, for them to fill in the gaps, which many of them have been absolutely amazing in filling in the gaps during this time, such as Comcast and Charter, AT&T, Comcast and Charter. I know they have expanded they've made their Wi-Fi hotspots public for public use. They, made they won't disconnect you for non-payment right now. The next 60 days are free. Comcast also has the Essentials program that they're offering for free, and also to that's for the low-income consumers. So I think we can do things like that, but most importantly, I can say that we can also just become very creative in how we use what we do have. If some of these schools don't have all of the access for remote learning, we can use what we do have. Is plenty of examples across the United States right now that's happening where the school districts and broadband companies or broadcasting companies are coming to the rescue. One instance is Indianapolis public school system. Just this week, I think yesterday, they just announced a partnership to bring learning on their television stations from 8 to 10, essentially, because they know that the majority of their students are low income and don't have access to broadband. So in the immediate, those type of things need to happen. But going forward, definitely E-rate program.
Yeah.
Daniel, can we talk a little bit about those free and low cost offers from the
Absolutely,
providers?
yeah, please.
So yes, they are super valuable, I agree. They're a Band-Aid though. There's limited eligibility. There are, depending upon which provider it is, Comcast has the widest eligibility. Charter's is more narrow, Verizon's is pretty narrow, AT&T's is okay. But then also if you have bad debt with the companies, then can't sign up. Charters is kind of a bureaucratic mess. They didn't connect it to their low cost offer. So when folks try to sign up, they're often told that they need to commit to a contract or to service after the fact, which is just totally insane because it's a crisis right now. But I don't think they intended that. I think what they intended was right, but there wasn't a good communication with the call centers. So we get really mixed messages when folks try to use it. So I guess that the point gets to Congress needs to step in and needs to help with this because the charity of the ISPs is not sufficient. It is appreciated, but it is not enough.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask in terms of, what should Congress be thinking about? Because I mean, at least I know I was impressed by the fact that, the companies moved before anyone else moved in terms of, all the announcements about here's how you can get access. Even if there are problems that you've mentioned, the fact that they stepped up so quickly was impressive because they moved at the speed that nobody else could move. I mean, they basically provided internet access even before a lot of kids were, even before the schools had said, well, we're going to go online, and they gave them time to sign up. But as you mentioned, I mean, this can only be an interim solution if we're relying on industry to provide this basically themselves. So what should Congress be focused on next, especially in the next stimulus, where we know the homework gap is important, we just spent all this money, and yet this wasn't part of it?
With the urgency of the situation, I think they have to use existing mechanisms in federal government to get out additional help. And really those existing mechanisms are E-rate and Lifeline. So using E-rate to go through schools and libraries to get folks access at home. Like, kudos to everybody putting wireless in parking lots, but can you imagine? Okay, kids, everybody get in the car. If any of those kids is like super high energy or I don't know, under the age of what, you want to say like 8? I just can't imagine. I was joking with my sister, like, sure, the youngest is going to be like, yes, mom, I'll just sit here quietly while my sister does her homework. Like, we have to get internet into homes. I just really don't see any other way that this is possibly going to work. So anyhow, I totally went on a tangent there, but so E-rate and Lifeline. And so the Lifeline one would be a broadband subsidy for, we could determine who's eligible. But I think a current problem we have is that after those free 2 months of the internet that the internet service providers have generously provided, what happens after that? People just don't have it. Some of the larger internet service providers might be able to financially, might be able to handle extending it. Smaller providers are going to be like, look, you are already tapping me at the extent here. So we have to figure out a way to have additional support. And I think all of us are realizing, even through this school district, what happens in the fall, we may not be going back to normal for a while.
Is there a dollar figure that you're looking at in terms of what Congress needs to support?
I think the dollar figures being thrown around right now have more to do with subsidy amounts, like lower speeds, maybe $30, higher speeds, maybe $50. But the amount needed from Congress is going to depend upon who's eligible. And then how many people how many households who are eligible actually sign up. Like with Lifeline, right now it's only 25%. So I think the total dollar amount really varies when you start messing with your spreadsheet.
Danielle, to this point about, not just the immediate short term, the next 2 months, but really looking into the fall and next year. I think we're not sure we're going to be open in the fall. Even if we are, there's concerns about, second waves or additional waves where schools are going to be shut down for extended periods of time. And then there's just the bigger question of, so many children have missed out on this, good education for now, basically, 5 to 6 months. They're going to be struggling and falling behind. They're going to need access to additional enrichment and materials, and not having internet will put them even more behind. So, how do we redefine those priorities for addressing the homework gap? So it's not just the short-term Band-Aid, but that longer-term fix. What's your message on that?
Well, eventually we're going to have to go back at some point. We may not be as soon as we would like, but we're going to go back. And in that in knowing that, we need to be thinking about what does that look like when we go back. That's why I do agree with Angela with the E-rate program, because at the moment, I guess, not a necessarily immediate need because the schools are shutting down, but once they open up again, there will be a lag between seeking funding and also the build out to school and libraries. So I would say that we need to focus on this now for when we do actually go back to our norm, if whatever that may be.
Yeah, absolutely. Angela, I wanted to ask you, it was brought up a little bit about rural versus urban areas. And so, when we're looking at those challenges, what do you see as the different challenges there? And, what are the kind of unique needs that we see in each of these areas in bringing kids online?
I think it's important to look at the unique needs, but we also need to look at what is similar amongst them. So the big difference being infrastructure availability. It is available in some rural areas, not all. It might be more, it's often more expensive in some rural areas because they have less competition. We don't have a lot of competition in urban areas, but we have more often than rural areas. And then I think the important point is that Census data tells us that there's 18 million US households that don't have internet in their homes. 14 million of those 18 million are urban areas. So that tells us it's not because infrastructure is not available, it's because it's expensive or they don't have the digital skills to use it. So it's also important for us to be looking at that overall, how do we get at affordability? How do we make sure everybody has devices, the right devices, because a mobile phone is often not the right device. And that they have digital skills, which today, since you can't go someplace to take can't go to the Urban League for a class, right? So how do we provide that over the phone is really a question. So a lot of folks on the ground are figuring that out right now, and they're going to need financial support to do that.
Yeah, Danielle, I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about those types of factors that we need to address to make online education successful, because obviously connectivity, it's an important step, it's the first step, but the real question is going to be educational outcomes and how that all works.
Yeah, especially I think what we need to look at in addition to connectivity is just looking at what these children's home life looks like a lot of the time. We like to focus a lot on the tech side, but what would make them successful in their home life? We have to think about their structure. What are they doing every day? Do they have a parent who is an essential worker? Do they have a parent who's always working, whether or not they're an essential worker? Are they responsible for other siblings? Like, what would keep them from being able to do the things that they needed to do outside of just not having internet connection? And these are the things that I think we need to think about when we're taking into consideration these policy considerations. We have to inject a little bit more empathy for the kids in low income and urban areas, what they're facing, because yes, they may have access at home, but if they have to take care of their 4 other brothers and sisters and make sure that they're eating and make sure everybody is bathed and everybody, and supporting their parent who is an essential worker in the front lines right now, they're not going to log on. They're not going, connectivity really won't matter at that point. So we have to think of creative ways how we can support these children in their daily lives so they can actually function and do what they need to do with the connectivity.
Yeah, and so one of the challenges I think for schools is thinking about all those different types of families. I mean, you have a single parent household, for example, where or a household where the parents are working and they're not there, and so much of the online learning, it's online learning, but it's online learning with the parents being heavily involved. So how should schools be thinking about those types of challenges? And Danielle, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think that it's the same that I've been saying, like creative solutions, just as Commissioner Rosen-Worcel said, we have to get really creative. I think that the situation in Indianapolis is absolutely amazing, what they're doing with television. I mean, it's not the best, it's not connectivity, but it's something that will get us through in the meantime. Also, school buses, having Bluetooth connectivity or Wi-Fi hotspots on school buses and literally driving out to the neighborhoods where these kids are. That's happening right now in Michigan. As far as, and just like what I talked about with, in regards to the connectivity, other things that we could be doing, that can be applied to single parent households too. What are these children's structure. What is their home life? What are they responsible for? Are they eating? Because in New York, they're literally giving out free meals to a lot of students who depend on this. So we have to think more about what would keep them from doing stuff if a parent is off providing for the family, or if there's only one parent in general in the picture anyway. We have to think about what their school life, what their home life is, and how we can adapt to that and help them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm a parent, and I have to say the experience so far, I mean, the teachers I know are trying their best. The school that I'm at, you know, they're doing their best to help, but you know, it's incredibly complicated. You know, there's 5 different apps, you know, there's, you know, lots of confusion about how you log in, different passwords for everything. It's not, you know, the seamless user experience that you want, right? And it's, you know, the workload that they put on, you know, even just to find out what your assignment is that day. By that point, you're exhausted, and you know, it's not a good experience yet. And so, you know, I guess one of the questions that I had is, you know, why have schools been so slow to roll out online education in general? You know, this is something that conceptually has been around for a while. You know, do we, you know, you would think that at least even if every school couldn't do it great, at least some would be doing it at a very high level. And I haven't seen too many examples where, you know, someone's really mastered this, and you know, everyone's pointing and saying, yes, we need to be just like this one school that's figured out everything. You know, what have been the barriers to holding it back, even if it's, you know, partial adoption, or, you know, we don't see a lot of virtual charter schools. You know, what's going on there?
I think, Angela, I think you're muted, Angela.
Sorry, Daniel. I think it has a lot to do with the inequality of our schools in lots of different ways. So you can look at which schools already had devices, which ones didn't have to scramble. Some of them gave up. Honestly, like, we won't name names, but some schools were just like, okay, we can't do it. Everybody just off for the rest of the year. Hope the weather's nice. Like that's what, because they couldn't figure out how to get devices in the homes. They couldn't figure out how to make sure everybody had internet. They couldn't make sure the teachers were up to speed on how to teach online. So the schools that kids already had devices, they had already worked on the connectivity piece. The teachers may have had some digital skills enough that they were doing it in the classroom and were able to translate some of that to the home. They're the ones that were ahead of the game. Which schools are those? The ones that have more resources.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback off that. It's completely true. It's an example out of, I can't remember where it is, Philadelphia, that basically originally said that they weren't going to be participating in online home learning because they didn't have the capabilities. And if they couldn't give it to everybody, they weren't going to give it to anyone. But just recently, I think yesterday, they started their first week of home learning 38 days after they've been sent home. So yeah, these are the issues that, you know, these communities don't have the resources that they need. They just don't. And so that's the reason why you're seeing these slow rollouts. And I do think part of it also is just culture and tradition of not even having the need or the access a lot of the time to these technologies. It's like, okay, we can make do with whatever. So it's multiple issues, but I would definitely say is that people don't have these schools that didn't do it did not have the resources to do it at that time.
And I think there's also a piece about the teachers being digitally skilled, right? Some are more so than others, and had the school already put resources into helping the teachers become more, use the tools that are out there. It is a bigger connected issue with adults in general, not just teachers, just adults in general. It's a continuous learning curve. All of us, if we're not keeping up with it constantly, and there is always something. Somebody told me yesterday about a tool, and I was like, what? That could have saved me so much time. How did I not know that tool existed? And I mentioned it to my daughter, and she's like, oh yeah, I use that. How come you didn't tell me? Right? Like that stuff is all out there. But if we're not constantly keeping up with it, and a lot of us don't, teachers are just the same as like every other adult.
I think that's a great point. The last question I had for you, and then I want to turn to the audience questions that we're getting. is around the question of online harassment. I mean, one of the things we've seen already pop up, I mean, people have talked about Zoom bombing, but we've seen in some of the schools that have implemented online learning, there's forums where you're seeing, not just kind of the traditional student hijinks, but, real hate speech, harassment of other students, bullying, harassment of teachers. Maybe this gets to part of this is digital literacy, but how should schools be thinking about managing these security and privacy concerns? And should that be part of the funding structure as well? Danielle, maybe you can start.
As far as the security, I think schools definitely need to be thinking about that. I know the FTC recently reminded ed tech companies that they needed to be taking these into consideration, reminding schools that they need to be taking this into consideration when they're negotiating their contracts with these tech ed vendors about what information is collected, if it's going to be destroyed after it's done or after they don't need it anymore. So there are various different things that need to be taken in consideration. But I would say that I believe it was the DOE's, the Department of Education's Privacy Office, released a model contract or model things that you should take into consideration when thinking about children's privacy and their education and how we're blending them together.
I think the other piece of it is the digital citizenship training for the kids, for them to learn how to be respectful online. Again, I think it is connected to adults. There are some adults who don't know how to be respectful online. So we can have that curriculum be in our schools with the intent that some of it might even flow to their elders.
I'll add on that I think that there probably needs to be some type of campaign, sort of how we always do campaigns like they did, a long time ago, the DARE campaign, Say No to Drugs. Right. There needs to be some type of campaign that shows children, one, they don't need to be doing this. And then two, if you do encounter this, what do you do? You don't need to go back and respond and do other craziness back. We need to equip them with some techniques on how to deal with these things online, because most likely they're going to deal with it. But if we show them how they can handle it or diffuse it, I think that would be something that would be beneficial to the kids.
Yeah, thank you. So as I mentioned, I want to open it up for audience questions. If you're watching on itif.org, you can use the Q&A form that's under the video. If you're watching on YouTube, then there's a link in the event description that you can follow to the site where you can post questions. We already have a number that have come in. So the first question I want to ask is, how can the needs of special needs students be met in existing or potential online programming?
I would say, again, we have to be creative. We really have to think about the ways that these children learn, what their home life is, and how we can adapt to that. If we have special needs children, maybe that traditionally can't sit in front of, a teacher, or who need teacher instruction to sit still, we have to think of other ways. Maybe, like I said, what happened in Indianapolis, a television show. That's something that how they're producing these things to be very fun, informational. They're doing it for free, and they're providing it to the students online. So these are ways that we can do, but there's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of creative solutions that we have to come up with to meet each child's individual needs.
There's another question here. I think we touched a little bit on this, but maybe we can expand. What are the barriers that prevent E-rate funding from being used to connect students at home? Why aren't those funds already being used that way?
There's disagreement, even though Commissioner Rosenworcel didn't want to talk about the disagreement, but there is disagreement as to whether or not the funds can be used outside of a building. So as she noted, it has in the past been used for that, and we need to get back to that. My understanding, because I do think it can be used outside of the building, and it should be used outside of the building. But my understanding is that there's some worry about precedent. If we did it during the emergency, might we want to continue afterwards? Probably.
Danielle, anything to add? Or?
No, she hit it
Okay,
right on
great.
exactly.
So another question came in, is there a role for public-private partnerships to increase access to internet-capable devices through refurbishing or support for lending or low-cost purchasing?
Most certainly. So NDIA is partnered with the National Christina Foundation. They've set up the website donatetechnology.com. They coordinate a national network of nonprofit computer refurbishers. So those nonprofit computer refurbishers, all independently, 501c3s, they need more computers to be brought in to be refurbished. So there's a big opportunity there. And sometimes it's going to come from government, sometimes it's going to come from corporations, but then it often goes out through schools. They'll do distributions. One of the examples that I heard, I'm going to get wrong which one it was, so I'll wait on that. But the example was that they had 3 lines when the cars came in to pick up their food. Right, so a lot of the school districts are providing food for the students, and sometimes it's a pickup kind of situation. So when the cars came into the parking lot, they were asked by a volunteer at the entrance of the parking lot, are you here for food, technology, or both? And then that determined which line the car got in. And so then if they were in the line for technology, they went home with a computer and instructions on the different free and low cost offers available in that area.
So we have one question here. What's more important, healthcare for all or leaving no child offline?
Don't make us answer that.
Yeah, I don't think we can
That's
choose.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
I thought your answer would be, all right. No, but a more serious question here. What's the opportunity for libraries to partner with schools to support students at home or even in a new parking lot hotspots? What should libraries be thinking about right now?
Yeah, so that's a new way for libraries to think, right? Before we went to libraries, we can't go to the library anymore. They already have resources, right? Online books, and a lot of them have online programming now. So there are resources through libraries that's available online, but only if you have internet. And yes, some of them are opening up their parking lots. Kudos for them who do that. There's some who put the password in like great big billboards in the parking lots. That's awesome. But I do think the next step for libraries, and this is out of their norm, is that home internet. And it makes sense. So NDIA is working with Salt Lake City Public Library and others on a model where it is what we're calling a digital navigator. It's a person, a librarian, or a community member working with the library that helps guide community members through what's your options for internet, what's your options for a computer, and what is the digital task in front of you that's causing you angst, right? What is it you need to do right now? You need to apply for benefits. You need to help your child do their homework. What is it that you need to do? And to be that one-on-one support for folks, because they can't go to the library, they can't go to their community-based digital inclusion program anymore. So we have to find another way to help them. And I think it's over the phone.
I agree with everything Angela just said. It's just basically hitting on the same theme I've been saying, is creative solutions. You have to think outside the box right now because the need is so immediate that we have to have it right now. We can't wait. So I do agree with everything Angela just said.
There's a question about, somebody was more expressing a wish that the census had included a question about internet access in the home, but one of the continuous questions.
Actually, they did.
On the long form or on the short?
No, yeah, on the long form. So,
Yeah.
So you can go get the American Community Survey. You can go get that data now. Like it exists, and folks should definitely be using that data. There's 2 different tables. There's one that's wireline only, and there's one that's they call broadband anything above dial-up. Okay, let's just call it internet. But they call it broadband. And so there's those 2 tables, and you can get that data. There's 5-year data, 1-year data, depending upon how into your community you want to go. If you're in a metro area, you can get that 1-year data. And I very much encourage folks to go get it, because whatever that data is, it's worse.
Yeah. And the last question that we have here is, just around the long-term barriers. We hit on this, but I want to raise it again. Someone's asking, how do you address the needs of a parent or another adult to supervise the educational process with online learning at home? Again, this just kind of comes up with this issue. We talk about connectivity, we talk about getting the new apps, but are we really talking about leaving children alone at home to learn while parents are working, or what's that model really look like? What's kind of the long-term vision here?
I think that's two different questions, Daniel. I think it's what's happening now. Are kids really alone while they're yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
my daughter has a friend. Her mom has to go to work, single mom. The daughter is the only child. She's 9 years old and she's leading her own education. It just makes me want to cry, right? So it's a mess right now, I think is what we all need to agree, is that it's a huge mess. But long term, I think it is all the structural things in our society. It's not just, it's like Danielle was saying, right? It's not just the technology. It is, we got to deal with poverty. We need to make sure people are housing secure, right? The job, like it is all the things that influence this. Technology is not this standing item by itself. It is all mixed together.
And I think it's important to just realize that the majority of these kids who are home now, when their parents are gone, their parents were gone while they were at school. The difference is that they had school as their structure. They had school as their meals. They had school to go to for support. Now they don't have it. So that's why I keep stressing the need for creative solutions, like the ones that Angela mentioned that her organization is doing. These are the needed solutions. It has to be creative and it has to be targeted towards the people who need it the most.
Well, thank you so much. I think this is a really important conversation. I think everyone's waking up to just how important it is that we're connected, but also that we have devices, that we have apps that works, as you mentioned, that we have digital literacy in students and in teachers and administrators, and it's going to take the whole community to kind of get this working well. This won't be certainly the last conversation we're having on it, and I know that you're doing a lot of really interesting work. Thanks to everyone who joined us today for this conversation. And we'll be doing more of these throughout the month. We have one I just want to mention next week on telehealth and looking at the, the changes we've seen in regulation over the past month that have came very rapidly for accessing telehealth, but also looking forward into the future and how we can make some of these changes permanent so everyone can have access to these resources in their community. Thanks again for joining me. Thank you, Angela and Danielle.
Thank
Thank you, Daniel. Bye, Danielle.